Hi, Rama. It's week 5, day 4 of our Bible narrative reading plan. Today we pick up again where we left off in Genesis 29 and we'll be in Genesis 30 as well. I want to take the two main halves and address them out of order. I want to go to the end of Genesis 30 first, where we see in verse 25, we get the story of Jacob and him working for Laban and this whole sheep breeding process. It's a very interesting story. And the purpose behind all of this is to see, again, that God is at work and that Jacob's prosperity can't be attributed to Laban. It can't be attributed to anyone but God in this very interesting breeding process that shows, again, that Jacob was an excellent herdsman. He knew a lot about genetics even before we knew what the word genetics meant, but Jacob is a very proficient and good farmer. But what I want to point out to you is the part of the story that we would often just run right by, and that's the story of all of Jacob's children in Genesis 29, starting in verse 31 and then going all the way through chapter 30, verse 24. We saw yesterday that Jacob the deceiver has been deceived and he was tricked. He was planning to marry Rachel after 7 years of hard work. Instead, he wakes up and realizes that he is now married to Leah. And so after that week of wedding celebration, as we saw, he is now also married to Rachel, and he works another 7 years. During this working process, we see the relationship between Jacob and his two wives. And we also got introduced into the story even yesterday. I didn't mention, but the subject of servants is brought up, the handmaids. And so now you have not just wives, but also servants. And so you have 4 women who Jacob is eventually going to have children with all 4 of them. And I want you to pay attention when you read this story. Go back and look at it again. Pay attention to if you have footnotes in the Bible that you're reading telling you what these names mean, because all of these names are significant. We don't necessarily use names in this way today, but in this time, these names tell the story. They tell you what the woman who's giving birth, the mother of the child, it tells you how she's feeling. Rachel is barren, and because God has divinely appointed that way, but Leah, the wife who it says is hated, the wife that Jacob didn't really want to marry, her womb is opened and she gives birth. And she gives her first child, his name is Reuben, which means see, a son. And so it's as if she's saying, look, I'm giving you a child. And you just follow the story. We don't have time to look at every name, but I want you to read that on your own. Look at the names and what they mean, because they're telling you the story. They're telling you of how neglected, isolated, forgotten that Leah feels, and she's desperately trying to please Jacob, to win his affection by giving him children. And then the story continues when Rachel begins to have children, and then they're competing against one another, and they have their maid servants involved so that they can see who gives Jacob more children. And then you have the whole story of the mandrakes, and you just see such a divisive, unhealthy, just a terrible home life, a terrible situation, that even as Jacob is the one receiving the promise, he is a deceptive man. And his life is filled with strife because of the way that he has acted and conducted himself. So you go through all these kids, you go through the different stories with the wife, pay attention to their names, but get down to Genesis chapter 30, verse 22. See when God acts. Everything else has just been telling you the story. It's been telling you the names, but God acts in this verse, verse 22. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceives a son and bears a son and says, God has taken away my reproach. She calls his name Joseph and says, may the Lord add to me another son. So that's the historical part, but I want you to pay attention to those 3 verbs there. These are the 3 times that God acts in this story. Everything else is Jacob acting and Rachel acting and Leah acting, but now God acts. He remembers and he listens and he acts. He opens her womb. And I want this to be an encouragement to you as a Christian, because even as we're looking back at this story, there's much for us to learn, to see what God is doing, the big narrative. That's the point of this Bible reading plan. But when you look at this messy family, you may resonate with it more than you realize, more than you want to admit. You probably don't have this many wives going on, and that's a blessing from God. Do things God's way. But your family life might resemble this mess. And as one professor told me when he looked at this text, he said there's a mercy in the middle of the mess. And we see that in the way that God acts. He remembers and he listens and he acts. So be encouraged with that. Even if your family life may look a bit messy, just like Jacob's family, God is still the same, and He's still acting. He's still extending mercy in the middle of your mess. Here's a summary of today's reading. For more information, go to tunemyheart.org.